Hello, welcome to the Short Story Workshop. My name is Matt Bowles. I'm here with Melody Bowles and Simone King. This week we are going to be talking about The Dream by Mary Shelley. And I picked the story this week. Mary Shelley, of course, the author of Frankenstein. I really like her prose style. It has a little bit of the 19th century long-windedness, but I think for good reason, because this is a story that was written in the 1800s but set in the 1600s. So we've got a weird 200-year time skip going on. It's primarily about this weird romance where the main character is in love with someone who is responsible for murdering her family. So it's a bit weird, Shakespeare-like. I really enjoyed it. I hope you will too. Here is The Dream by Mary Shelley.
Ci dici mal d'amore, dici una falsità. Italian song. The time of the occurrence of the little legend about to be narrated was that of the commencement of the reign of Henry IV of France, whose accession and conversion, while they brought peace to the kingdom whose throne he ascended, were inadequate to heal the deep wounds mutually inflicted by the inimical parties. Private feuds, and the memory of mortal injuries, existed between those now apparently united, and often did the hands that had clasped each other in seeming friendly greeting, involuntarily, as the grasp was released, clasp the dagger's hilt, as fit as spokesmen to their passions and the words of courtesy that had just fallen from their lips. Many of the fiercer Catholics retreated to their distant provinces, and while they concealed in solitude their rankling discontent, not less keenly did they long for the day when they might show it openly. In a large and fortified chateau built on a rugged steep overlooking the Loire, not far from the town of Nantes, dwelt the last of her race, and the heiress of their fortunes, the young and beautiful Countess de Villeneuve. She had spent the preceding year in complete solitude in her secluded abode, and the mourning she wore for a father and two brothers, the victims of the civil wars, was a graceful and good reason why she did not appear at court and mingle with its festivities. But the orphan countess inherited a high name and broad lands, and it was soon signified to her that the king, her guardian, desired that she should bestow them, together with her hand, upon some noble whose birth and accomplishments should entitle him to the gift. Constance, in reply, expressed her intention of taking vows and retiring to a convent. The king earnestly and resolutely forbade this act, believing such an idea to be the result of sensibility overwrought by sorrow, and relying on the hope that, after a time, the genial spirit of youth would break through this cloud. A year passed, and still the countess persisted, and at last Henry, unwilling to exercise compulsion, desirous, too, of judging for himself of the motives that led one so beautiful, young, and gifted with fortune's favour, to desire to bury herself in a cloister, announced his intention, now that the period of her mourning was expired, of visiting her chateau, and if he brought not with him, the monarch said, inducement sufficient to change her design, he would yield his consent to its fulfilment. Many a sad hour had Constance passed, many a day of tears, and many a night of restless misery. She had closed her gates against every visitant, and like the Lady Olivia in Twelfth Night, vowed herself to loneliness and weeping. Mistress of herself, she easily silenced the entreaties and remonstrances of underlings, and nursed her grief as if it had been the thing she loved. Yet it was too keen, too bitter, too burning to be a favoured guest. In fact, Constance, young, ardent, and vivacious, battled with it, struggled and longed to cast it off, but all that was joyful in itself, or fair in outward show, only served to renew it, and she could best support the burden of her sorrow with patience, when, yielding to it, it oppressed but did not torture her. Constance had left the castle to wander in the neighbouring grounds. Lofty and extensive as were the apartments of her abode, she felt pent up within their walls, beneath their fretted roofs. The spreading uplands and the antique wood, associated to her with every dear recollection of her past life, enticed her to spend hours and days beneath their leafy coverts. The motion and change eternally working as the wind stirred among the boughs, or the journeying sun rained its beams through them, soothed and called her out of that dull sorrow which clutched her heart with so unrelenting a pang beneath her castle roof. There was one spot on the verge of the well-wooded park, one nook of ground whence she could discern the country extended beyond, yet which was in itself thick set with tall, umbrageous trees, a spot which she had forsworn, yet whither unconsciously her steps for ever tended, and where now again, for the 20th time that day, she had unaware found herself. She sat upon a grassy mound, and looked wistfully on the flowers she had herself planted to adorn the verdurous recess, to her the temple of memory and love. She held the letter from the king, which was the parent to her of so much despair. Dejection sat upon her features, and her gentle heart asked fate why, so young, unprotected, and forsaken, she should have to struggle with this new form of wretchedness. I but ask, she thought, to live in my father's halls, in the spot familiar to my infancy, to water with my frequent tears the graves of those I loved, and here in these woods, where such a mad dream of happiness was mine, to celebrate for ever the obsequies of hope. A rustling among the boughs now met her ear, her heart beat quick, all again was still. "Foolish girl," she half muttered, "dupe of thine own passionate fancy, because here we met, because seated here I have expected, and sounds like these have announced, his dear approach, so now every coney as it stirs, and every bird as it awakens silence speaks of him. O Gaspar! Mine once, never again will this beloved spot be made glad by thee, never more." Again the bushes were stirred, and footsteps were heard in the brake. She rose, her heart beat high, it must be that silly Manon, with her impertinent entreaties for her to return. But the steps were firmer and slower than would be those of her waiting woman, and now, emerging from the shade, she too plainly discerned the intruder. Her first impulse was to fly, but once again to see him, to hear his voice, once again before she placed eternal vows between them, to stand together, and find the wide chasm filled which absence had made, could not injure the dead, and would soften the fatal sorrow that made her cheek so pale. And now he was before her, the same beloved one with whom she had exchanged vows of constancy. He, like her, seemed sad, nor could she resist the imploring glance that entreated her for one moment to remain. "I come, lady," said the young knight, "without a hope to bend your inflexible will. I come but once again to see you, and to bid you farewell before I depart for the Holy Land. I come to beseech you not to immure yourself in the dark cloister to avoid one as hateful as myself, one you will never see more. Whether I die or live, France and I are parted forever." "That were fearful, were it true," said Constance, "but King Henry will never so lose his favourite cavalier. The throne you helped to build, you still will guard. Nay, as I ever had power over thought of thine, go not to Palestine." "One word of yours could detain me, one smile, Constance." And the youthful lover knelt before her, but her harsher purpose was recalled by the image, once so dear and familiar, now so strange and so forbidden. "Linger no longer here," she cried. "No smile, no word of mine will ever again be yours. Why are you here, here, where the spirits of the dead wander, and claiming these shades as their own, curse the false girl who permits their murderer to disturb their sacred repose?" "When love was young, and you were kind," replied the knight, "you taught me to thread the intricacies of these woods. You welcomed me to this dear spot, where once you vowed to be my own, even beneath these ancient trees." "A wicked sin it was," said Constance, "to unbar my father's doors to the son of his enemy, and dearly is it punished." The young knight gained courage as she spoke, yet he dared not move, lest she, who every instant appeared ready to take flight, should be startled from her momentary tranquillity. But he slowly replied, "Those were happy days, Constance, full of terror and deep joy, when evening brought me to your feet, and while hate and vengeance were as its atmosphere to yonder frowning castle, this leafy starlit bower was the shrine of love." "Happy, miserable days!" echoed Constance, "when I imagined good could arise from failing in my duty, and that disobedience would be rewarded of God. Speak not of love, Gaspar. A sea of blood divides us for ever. Approach me not. The dead and the beloved stand even now between us. Their pale shadows warn me of my fault, and menace me for listening to their murderer." "That am not I!" exclaimed the youth. "Behold, Constance, we are each the last of our race. Death has dealt cruelly with us, and we are alone. It was not so when first we loved, when parent, kinsman, brother, nay, my own mother, breathed curses on the house of Villeneuve, and in spite of all, I blessed it. I saw thee, my lovely one, and blessed it. The God of peace planted love in our hearts, and with mystery and secrecy we met during many a summer night in the moonlit dells, and when daylight was abroad, in this sweet recess we fled to avoid its scrutiny, and here, even here, when now I kneel in supplication, we both knelt and made our vows. Shall they be broken?" Constance wept as her lover recalled the images of happy hours. "Never!" she exclaimed. "Oh, never! Thou knowest, or wilt soon know, Gaspar, the faith and resolves of one who dare not be yours. Was it for us to talk of love and happiness, when war and hate and blood were raging around? The fleeting flowers our young hands strewed were trampled by the deadly encounter of mortal foes. By your father's hand mine died, and little boots it to know whether, as my brothers swore, and you deny, your hand did or did not deal the blow that destroyed him. You fought among those by whom he died. Say no more, no other word. It is impiety towards the young reposing dead to hear you. Go, Gaspar, forget me. Under the chivalrous and gallant Henry your career may be glorious, and some fair girl will listen, as once I did, to your vows, and be made happy by them. Farewell! May the Virgin bless you. In my cell and cloister home I will not forget the best Christian lesson, to pray for our enemies. Gaspar, farewell!" She glided hastily from the bower. With swift steps she threaded the glade and sought the castle. Once within the seclusion of her own apartment, she gave way to the burst of grief that tore through her gentle bosom like a tempest. For hers was that worst sorrow which taints past joys, making remorse wait upon the memory of bliss, and linking love and fancied guilt in such fearful society as that of the tyrant when he bound a living body to a corpse. Suddenly a thought darted into her mind. At first she rejected it as puerile and superstitious, but it would not be driven away. She called hastily for her attendant. "Manon," she said, "didst thou ever sleep on St. Catherine's couch?" Manon crossed herself. "Heaven forfend! None ever did, since I was born, but two. One fell into the Loire and was drowned. The other only looked upon the narrow bed, and returned to her own home without a word. It is an awful place, and if the votary have not led a pious and good life, woe betide the hour when she rests her head on the holy stone." Constance crossed herself also. "As for our lives, it is only through our Lord and the blessed saints that we can any of us hope for righteousness. I will sleep on that couch to-morrow night." "Dear, my lady, and the king arrives to-morrow." "The more need that I resolve. It cannot be that misery so intense should dwell in any heart, and no cure be found. I had hoped to be the bringer of peace to our houses, and is the good work to be for me a crown of thorns? Heaven shall direct me. I will rest to-morrow night on St. Catherine's bed, and if, as I have heard, the saint deigns to direct her votaries in dreams, I will be guided by her, and believing that I act according to the dictates of heaven, I shall feel resigned even to the worst." The king was on his way to Nantes from Paris, and he slept on this night at a castle but a few miles distant. Before dawn a young cavalier was introduced into his chamber. The knight had a serious, nay, a sad aspect, and all beautiful as he was in feature and limb, looked wayworn and haggard. He stood silent in Henry's presence, who, alert and gay, turned his lively blue eyes upon his guest, saying gently, "So thou foundest her obdurate, Gaspar." "I found her resolved on our mutual misery. Alas, my liege, it is not, credit me, the least of my grief that Constance sacrifices her own happiness when she destroys mine. And thou believest that she will say nay to the galliard chevalier whom we ourselves present to her." "Oh, my liege, think not that thought. It cannot be. My heart deeply, most deeply thanks you for your generous condescension. But she whom her lovers voice in solitude, whose entreaties, when memory and seclusion aided the spell, could not persuade, will resist even your majesty's commands, she is bent upon entering a cloister, and I, so please you, will now take my leave. I am henceforth a soldier of the cross." "Gaspar," said the monarch, "I know woman better than thou. It is not by submission nor tearful plaints she is to be won. Death of her relatives naturally sits heavy at the young countess's heart, and nourishing in solitude her regret and her repentance, she fancies that heaven itself forbids your union. Let the voice of the world reach her, the voice of earthly power and earthly kindness, the one commanding, the other pleading, and both finding response in her own heart, and by my fay and the holy cross she will be yours. Let our plan still hold. And now to horse, the morning wears, and the sun is risen." The king arrived at the bishop's palace, and proceeded forthwith to mass in the cathedral. A sumptuous dinner succeeded, and it was afternoon before the monarch proceeded through the town beside the Loire, to where a little above Nantes the Château Villeneuve was situated. The young countess received him at the gate. Henry looked in vain for the cheek blanched by misery, the aspect of downcast despair which he had been taught to expect. Her cheek was flushed, her manner animated, her voice scarce tremulous. She loves him not, thought Henry, or already her heart has consented. A collation was prepared for the monarch, and after some little hesitation, arising even from the cheerfulness of her mien, he mentioned the name of Gaspar. Constance blushed instead of turning pale, and replied very quickly, Tomorrow good, my liege. I ask for a respite, but until tomorrow all will then be decided. Tomorrow I am vowed to God, or She looked confused, and the king, at once surprised and pleased, said, "Then you hate not young de Vaudemont, you forgive him for the inimical blood that warms his veins." "We are taught that we should forgive, that we should love our enemies," the countess replied, with some trepidation. "Now, by Saint Denis, that is a right welcome answer for the novice," said the king, laughing. "What ho, my faithful serving man! Dan Apollo in disguise! Come forward and thank your lady for her love." In such disguise that it concealed him from all, the cavalier had hung behind, and viewed with infinite surprise the demeanour and calm countenance of the lady. He could not hear her words, but was this even she whom he had seen trembling and weeping the evening before? This she whose very heart was torn by conflicting passion, who saw the pale ghosts of parent and kinsman stand between her and the lover whom more than her life she adored? It was a riddle hard to solve. The king's call was in unison with his impatience, and he sprang forward. He was at her feet, while she, still passion-driven, overwrought by the very calmness she had assumed, uttered one cry as she recognized him, and sank senseless on the floor. All this was very unintelligible. Even when her attendants had brought her to life, another fit succeeded, and then passionate floods of tears, while the monarch, waiting in the hall, eyeing the half-eaten collation and humming some romance in commemoration of woman's waywardness, knew not how to reply to Vaudemont's look of bitter disappointment and anxiety. At length the countess' chief attendant came with an apology. Her lady was ill, very ill. The next day she would throw herself at the king's feet, at once to solicit his excuse and to disclose her purpose. "Tomorrow, again tomorrow. Does tomorrow bear some charm, maiden?" said the king. "Can you read us the riddle, pretty one? What strange tale belongs to tomorrow that all rests on its advent?" Manon coloured, looked down, and hesitated. But Henry was no tyro in the art of enticing ladies' attendants to disclose their lady's counsel. Manon was besides frightened by the countess' scheme, on which she was still obstinately bent, so she was the more readily induced to betray it. To sleep in St. Catherine's bed, to rest on a narrow ledge overhanging the deep rapid Loire, and if, as was most probable, the luckless dreamer escaped from falling into it, to take the disturbed visions that such uneasy slumber might produce for the dictate of heaven, was a madness of which even Henry himself could scarcely deem any woman capable. But could Constance, her whose beauty was so highly intellectual, and whom he had perpetually praised for her strength of mind and talents, could she be so strangely infatuated, and can passion play such freaks with us, like death, levelling even the aristocracy of the soul, and bringing noble and peasant, the wise and foolish, under one thraldom? It was strange, yet she must have her way. That she hesitated in her decision was much, and it was to be hoped that St. Catherine would play no ill-natured part. Should it be otherwise, a purpose to be swayed by a dream might be influenced by other waking thoughts. To the more material kind of danger, some safeguard should be brought. There is no feeling more awful than that which invades a weak human heart bent upon gratifying its ungovernable impulses in contradiction to the dictates of conscience. Forbidden pleasures are said to be the most agreeable. It may be so to rude natures, to those who love to struggle, combat, and contend, who find happiness in a fray, and joy in the conflict of passion. But softer and sweeter was the gentle spirit of Constance, and love and duty contending crushed and tortured her poor heart. To commit her conduct to the inspirations of religion, or, if it was so to be named, of superstition, was a blessed relief. The very perils that threatened her undertaking gave a zest to it. To dare for his sake was happiness. The very difficulty of the way that led to the completion of her wishes at once gratified her love and distracted her thoughts from her despair. Or if it was decreed that she must sacrifice all, the risk of danger and of death were of trifling import in comparison with the anguish which would then be her portion for ever. The night threatened to be stormy, the raging wind shook the casements, and the trees waved their huge shadowy arms, as giants might in fantastic dance and mortal broil. Constance and Manon, unattended, quitted the chateau by a postern, and began to descend the hillside. The moon had not yet risen, and though the way was familiar to both, Manon tottered and trembled, while the countess, drawing her silken cloak round her, walked with a firm step down the steep. They came to the river's side, where a small boat was moored, and one man was in waiting. Constance stepped lightly in, and then aided her fearful companion. In a few moments they were in the middle of the stream. The warm, tempestuous, animating, equinoctial wind swept over them. For the first time since her morning, a thrill of pleasure swelled the bosom of Constance. She hailed the emotion with double joy. It cannot be, she thought, that heaven will forbid me to love one so brave, so generous and so good as the noble Gaspar. Another I can never love. I shall die if divided from him. And this heart, these limbs, so alive with glowing sensation, are they already predestined to an early grave? Oh no! Life speaks aloud within them. I shall live to love. Do not all things love? The winds as they whisper to the rushing waters, the waters as they kiss the flowery banks, and speed to mingle with the sea. Heaven and earth are sustained by and live through love, and shall Constance alone, whose heart has ever been a deep gushing overflowing well of true affection, be compelled to set a stone upon the fount to lock it up forever? These thoughts bade fair for pleasant dreams, and perhaps the Countess, an adept in the blind god's lore, therefore indulged them the more readily. But as thus she was engrossed by soft emotions, Manon caught her arm. "Lady, look!" she cried. "It comes, yet the oars have no sound. Now the Virgin shield us! Would we were at home!" A dark boat glided by them. 4 rowers, habited in black cloaks, pulled at oars, which, as Manon said, gave no sound. Another sat at the helm. Like the rest, his person was veiled in a dark mantle, but he wore no cap, and though his face was turned from them, Constance recognised her lover. "Gaspar!" she cried aloud, "dost thou live?" But the figure in the boat neither turned his head nor replied, and quickly it was lost in the shadowy waters. How changed now was the fair Countess' reverie! Already heaven had begun its spell, and unearthly forms were around, as she strained her eyes through the gloom. Now she saw, and now she lost view of the bark that occasioned her terror, and now it seemed that another was there, which held the spirits of the dead, and her father waved her from shore, and her brothers frowned on her. Meanwhile they neared the landing. Her bark was moored in a little cove, and Constance stood upon the bank. Now she trembled, and half yielded to Manon's entreaty to return, till the unwise Suivant mentioned the king's and de Vaudemont's name, and spoke of the answer to be given to-morrow. What answer, if she turned back from her intent? She now hurried forward up the broken ground of the bank, and then along its edge, till they came to a hill which abruptly hung over the tide. A small chapel stood near. With trembling fingers the Countess drew forth the key and unlocked its door. They entered. It was dark, save that a little lamp, flickering in the wind, showed an uncertain light from before the figure of Saint Catherine. The 2 women knelt, they prayed, and then rising, with a cheerful accent the Countess bade her attendant good night. She unlocked a little low iron door. It opened on a narrow cavern. The roar of waters was heard beyond. "Thou mayest not follow, my poor Manon," said Constance, "nor dost thou much desire. This adventure is for me alone." It was hardly fair to leave the trembling servant in the chapel alone, who had neither hope nor fear, nor love nor grief to beguile her. But, in those days, esquires and waiting women often played the part of subalterns in the army, gaining knocks and no fame. Besides, Manon was safe in holy ground. The Countess meanwhile pursued her way groping in the dark through the narrow tortuous passage. At length what seemed light to her long darkened sense gleamed on her. She reached an open cavern in the overhanging hill's side, looking over the rushing tide beneath. She looked out upon the night. The waters of the Loire were speeding, as since that day have they ever sped, changeful yet the same. The heavens were thickly veiled with clouds. The wind in the trees was as mournful and ill-omened as if it rushed round a murderer's tomb. Constance shuddered a little, and looked upon her bed. A narrow ledge of earth, and a moss-grown stone bordering on the very verge of the precipice. She doffed her mantle, such was one of the conditions of the spell. She bowed her head, and loosened the tresses of her dark hair. She bared her feet, and thus, fully prepared for suffering to the utmost the chill influence of the cold night, she stretched herself on the narrow couch that scarcely afforded room for her repose, and whence, if she moved in sleep, she must be precipitated into the cold waters below. At first it seemed to her as if she never should sleep again. No great wonder that exposure to the blast and her perilous position should forbid her eyelids to close. At length she fell into a reverie so soft and soothing that she wished even to watch, and then by degrees her senses became confused, and now she was on St. Catherine's bed, the Loire rushing beneath, and the wild wind sweeping by, and now, oh whither? And what dreams did the saint send, to drive her to despair, or to bid her be blessed for ever? Beneath the rugged hill, upon the dark tide, another watched, who feared 1,000 things, and scarce dared hope. He had meant to precede the lady on her way, but when he found that he had outstayed his time, with muffled oars and breathless haste, he had shot by the bark that contained his Constance, nor even turned at her voice, fearful to incur her blame, and her commands to return. He had seen her emerge from the passage, and shuddered as she leant over the cliff. He saw her step forth, clad as she was in white, and could mark her as she lay on the ledge beetling above. What a vigil did the lovers keep, she given up to visionary thoughts, he knowing, and the consciousness thrilled his bosom with strange emotion, that love, and love for him, had led her to that perilous couch, and that while dangers surrounded her in every shape, she was alive only to the small still voice that whispered to her heart the dream which was to decide her destinies. She slept perhaps, but he waked and watched, and night wore away, as now praying, now entranced by alternating hope and fear, he sat in his boat, his eyes fixed on the white garb of the slumberer above. Morning? Was it morning that struggled in the clouds? Would morning ever come to waken her? And had she slept? And what dreams of weal or woe had peopled her sleep? Gaspar grew impatient. He commanded his boatmen still to wait, and he sprang forward, intent on clambering the precipice. In vain they urged the danger, nay, the impossibility of the attempt. He clung to the rugged face of the hill, and found footing where it would seem no footing was. The acclivity, indeed, was not high, the dangers of St. Catherine's bed arising from the likelihood that any one who slept on so narrow a couch would be precipitated into the waters beneath. Up the steep ascent Gaspar continued to toil, and at last reached the roots of a tree that grew near the summit. Aided by its branches, he made good his stand at the very extremity of the ledge, near the pillow on which lay the uncovered head of his beloved. Her hands were folded on her bosom, her dark hair fell round her throat and pillowed her cheek. Her face was serene. Sleep was there in all its innocence and in all its helplessness. Every wilder emotion was hushed, and her bosom heaved in regular breathing. He could see her heart beat as it lifted her fair hands crossed above. No statue hewn of marble in monumental effigy was ever half so fair, and within that surpassing form dwelt a soul true, tender, self-devoted, and affectionate as ever warmed a human breast. With what deep passion did Gaspar gaze, gathering hope from the placidity of her angel countenance! A smile wreathed her lips, and he too involuntarily smiled, as he hailed the happy omen, when suddenly her cheek was flushed, her bosom heaved, a tear stole from her dark lashes, and then a whole shower fell, as starting up she cried, "No, he shall not die! I will unloose his chains. I will save him." Gaspar's hand was there. He caught her light form ready to fall from the perilous couch. She opened her eyes and beheld her lover, who had watched over her dream of fate, and who had saved her. Manon also had slept well, dreaming or not, and was startled in the morning to find that she waked surrounded by a crowd. The little desolate chapel was hung with tapestry, the altar adorned with golden chalices. The priest was chanting mass to a goodly array of kneeling knights. Manon saw that King Henry was there, and she looked for another whom she found not, when the iron door of the cavern passage opened, and Gaspard de Vaudemont entered from it, leading the fair form of Constance, who, in her white robes and dark dishevelled hair, with a face in which smiles and blushes contended with deeper emotion, approached the altar, and kneeling with her lover, pronounced the vows that united them forever. It was long before the happy Gaspard could win from his lady the secret of her dream. In spite of the happiness she now enjoyed, she had suffered too much not to look back even with terror to those days when she thought love a crime, and every event connected with them wore an awful aspect. Many a vision, she said, she had that fearful night. She had seen the spirits of her father and brothers in paradise. She had beheld Gaspar victoriously combating among the infidels. She had beheld him in King Henry's court, favoured and beloved, and she herself, now pining in a cloister, now a bride, now grateful to heaven for the full measure of bliss presented to her, now weeping away her sad days, till suddenly she thought herself in Paynim land, and the saint herself, St. Catherine, guiding her unseen through the city of the infidels. She entered a palace, and beheld the miscreants rejoicing in victory, and then, descending to the dungeons beneath, they groped their way through damp vaults and low mildewed passages, to one cell, darker and more frightful than the rest. On the floor lay one with soiled and tattered garments, with unkempt locks and wild matted beard. His cheek was worn and thin, his eyes had lost their fire, his form was a mere skeleton, the chains hung loosely on the fleshless bones. And was it my appearance in that attractive state and winning costume that softened the hard heart of Constance? Asked Gaspar, smiling at this painting of what would never be. Even so, replied Constance, for my heart whispered me that this was my doing, and who could recall the life that waned in your pulses? Who restore, save the destroyer? My heart never warmed to my living happy knight, as then it did to his wasted image as it lay in the visions of night at my feet. A veil fell from my eyes, a darkness was dispelled from before me. Methought I then knew, for the first time, what life and what death was. I was bid believe that to make the living happy was not to injure the dead, and I felt how wicked and how vain was that false philosophy which placed virtue and good in hatred and unkindness. You should not die. I would loosen your chains and save you, and bid you live for love. I sprung forward, and the death I deprecated for you would, in my presumption, have been mine, then, when first I felt the real value of life, but that your arm was there to save me, your dear voice to bid me be blessed for evermore.
So, what do we think?
I liked it. I mean, I wasn't sure of the 19th century style because I always struggle with denseness, but at heart I like the story and she's wonderfully dramatic. Got a lot of elements I like, including the enemies to lovers, complicated romance trope, which I always appreciate.
I like it a lot too, but Constance needs to calm down. I'm worried about her. I know the drama is part of genre, but it was so over the top sometimes. I found it hard to take seriously.
I mean, yeah, the bit where she fainted. To be fair, good way to get out of awkward situations, just swoon.
I did really enjoy this story though. I like the concept of it, and I like prose style, although it's long-winded, works well, as you said before, for the kind of story that it is. It adds to the telling of it rather than just feeling needlessly long-winded, I suppose. It feels like it's long-winded but purposefully rather than just doing it because more words is better.
There are some really strange elements to this story, don't you think? There are a few, but I think in particular the part where the king talks to her and then it turns out that, what's his name, Gasper, is just in disguise listening.
Very Shakespearian.
And also when she sees him in the boat and he doesn't turn around, it's a bit freaky. Why would he not? And it later kind of explains, oh, I didn't because this. And I was just like, okay, well, it still seems a bit weird. But yeah, there are a couple odd bits and pieces. I think it probably adds to it feeling dreamlike.
I think I read that it was supposed to be that she didn't categorize it so much as a short story as a kind of legend. So it's supposed to have that kind of tell it around a dark fire feeling to it, like oral tradition.
Well, for one thing, the term short story didn't exist when this was written.
I read something like it was supposed to be a gothic fragment. I'd never heard that term before, but it apparently meant a story that was very short and didn't tell you the whole story. It just showed you like a little bit, so it threw you straight in, gave you some backstory, expanded a little bit, and didn't have a conclusive end almost.
I mean, what you just described as a short story.
But they called it something different.
I mean, I can kind of see where they come from because I can think of writing snippets or fragments of a story, and I can think of writing short stories, and the way I approach them is different. So I feel like there is a difference between a fragment of a story and a short story, because a short story is supposed to feel more cohesive, while a fragment can just feel like a snippet.
But this is a full, complete story.
Yeah, well, that's because I hadn't invented short stories yet.
Percy
So we have to call it that, so I had to call it something.
I think the fragment thing was specific to the Gothic genre as well, which was interesting. It was something specific to that kind of story at the time.
Do you think that she was, when she decided to sleep on this precarious ledge, did you think she was justified or just crazy?
Crazy.
I mean, you need some way of making your decisions, don't you, in life? Like, it's not the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
I mean, sleeping on a dangerous ledge, hoping that St. Catherine will give you a dream to tell you you're not a sinner is a choice.
It is. But also, like, nice to see you having a positive relationship with the supernatural rather than being like, oh no, you're haunting my house. Like, maybe if, like, I don't know, in The Conjuring or something, they just, sat them down for some tea and, like, have you heard the latest? Should I date him? I can't believe he did that. Would have sold so many horror movies. Like,
using the ghosts as, like, a dating coach.
They probably just want to be heard.
Like, the dead will clearly know if the dead are okay with what she's doing, so, seems there's a logic.
I would like it to read that.
It is a bit of a weird way to make a decision, but you've got to respect the audacity of it.
Just the drama of it as well. Not do what a normal person would do. I'm going to put my life in danger in order to make this decision. Does anyone know anything about St. Catherine? I should have looked this up beforehand.
She's a saint.
Christian saint and a virgin who was martyred in the early 4th century at the hands of the Emperor Maxentius, upon picking of the right Saint Catherine. She was both a princess and a noted scholar who became a Christian around the age of 14, converted hundreds of people to Christianity, and was martyred around the age of 18. So, nice young person according to Wikipedia. So the legend goes, paraphrasing from Wikipedia, but so from a young age she devoted herself to study after a vision of Virgin Mary and the child Jesus persuaded her to become a Christian. When the persecutions begun under Maxentius, she went to the emperor, which I think is pretty badass, and rebuked him for being cruel, which I love. And the emperor then summoned 50 of his best pagan philosophers and orators to dispute with her, hoping they would win, but she won the debate, which I think is important to note because I love badass women who defeat everyone in verbal battle. However, she was then scourged and imprisoned. Apparently blood flowed from her in streams, and spectators wept with pity, and Catherine gave no sign of fear. She was ordered to be imprisoned without food so she would starve to death. Apparently during her confinement, angels tended to her wounds with salve, and she was fed daily by a dove from heaven. A bright light and a fragrant perfume filled it, and Catherine came forth even more radiant and beautiful than before, after her imprisonment. The evil king person then tried to marry her, but she refused and declared that her spouse was Jesus Christ. He then had her condemned to death by being spiked on a breaking wheel, but it shattered at her touch. He's basically the Christian Rasputin or something here. Anyway.
She was executed, and then instead of blood, there was milk.
Okay, I wouldn't go to this particular saint for romantic advice. Like, I'm sorry. She declared that she was in love with Jesus. Like, she's not the best person to help you win your love of your life, is she really?
Not really, no.
At least go to, like, I don't know, Saint Valentine or something.
I just wanted to know if there was any reason why this particular saint, but I can see that there is not, so that's good.
That was pretty long-winded, but it was mildly entertaining.
Of course, it could be a different Saint Catherine. I think there's quite a lot of them.
Right.
Let's go with this one. It's fun.
But yeah, okay. You would say that Constance was not the most grounded of individuals then.
No,
but she was under quite a lot of pressure. It's a very difficult situation she's in, you know?
Well, she's the last of her bloodline, isn't she?
I mean, I feel like they wouldn't care so much if they didn't all want her land. Like, that's the whole basis for King Henry getting involved, isn't it? Like, he doesn't want her to die alone with her land unused.
Yeah, because at the beginning she's all, I'm going to be a nun.
It's like, it's fine if you're a nun, if so long as you're poor and ugly. But oh my god, we can't have a beautiful person with lots of land and riches that she could bequeath to one of my favourite people, be a nun.
It's true.
I did see that as her being just a bit dramatic, like, get thee to a nunnery.
It's a great phrase as well. Get thee to a nunnery.
Is she punishing herself for falling in love with the enemy? Is that it, I'm guessing?
Yeah. I mean, she's feeling very guilty about the whole thing, hence the somewhat absurd methodology.
I mean, it's not her fault. He's the one who killed them. He's the one who should go live in a nunnery.
Yeah, I guess. Although we never find out if he killed them directly or if he was just kind of there.
We also don't find out when their romance was. Was it before or after he killed them?
I got the impression it was before.
Yeah, before. And then there came war. And they were on different sides.
They're split by an ocean of blood.
It's pretty dramatic.
Yeah, so I guess we should talk about how Shakespearean some of the elements at play are here.
Right, because as mentioned, this was written in the 1800s but set in the 1600s. Shakespearean times.
So there's a direct reference to a character from Twelfth Night, which was the first thing I picked up. And then I kind of read more, and the more I read, the more I thought, this is very Shakespeare. And I'm not a Shakespeare expert, but of course I know Romeo and Juliet, And the basis for that play is that Romeo and Juliet belong to families who hate each other. And here she's in love with a guy who wars with her family and kills them. So I was like, that's a bit Shakespeare. Then, as I mentioned earlier, Gaspard has that strange disguise. Seems pretty Shakespeare. Ghosts and things, pretty Shakespeare. There's a King Henry, seems Shakespeare.
I mean, he was also a real person. Like, Shakespeare didn't invent King Henry.
I know, but he had plays based on one of the King Henrys, and I don't remember which one it was.
Multiple, didn't he?
So, the more I read, the more I was like checking things off that seemed a bit to reference Shakespeare or maybe reminded me of Shakespeare, and then I wondered if this was just sort of a pastiche because when I first started reading it, I thought this is going to be a tragedy, and I'm really glad it wasn't. So, did you both feel the same, or am I just reading too much into that one reference to Twelfth Night?
I agree that it was very Shakespeare, but I also think a lot of the elements you've talked about, such as disguises and all of that kind of thing, is also quite gothic, which is what she was also doing. So it's like gothic Shakespeare was kind of how I mentally categorized it, which was pretty cool.
It's pretty cool as genre mashups go. I do like it. Would you call it a genre mashup? I think I like the thought that she was doing it in the 1800s.
Well, I think she's just subconsciously gothic, whether she wants to be or not. It's kind of her thing.
But surely she didn't live her everyday life being like...
Well,
I mean, she spent a great deal of time at her mother's grave, so there's that.
Oh, really? Huh.
also she did some other wonderfully gothic things that we'll get to.
Yeah, I did enjoy sort of the Shakespeare influences on the story, and I became sort of more interested after I realised. I sort of read it again looking for it a bit more carefully, and I was like, oh, I see. It's structured a bit like one of the plays, maybe, or uses a lot of the elements.
But then those elements, it's worth bearing in mind, are also very popular.
Yeah.
They're not like explicitly Shakespearean things. He wasn't the first one to do them.
It's that reference to Twelfth Night that gets me and makes me think it was a conscious decision.
Oh, I agree, it was a conscious decision.
Yeah, definitely. 100%. Especially reading the other work that she did at the time. This one stands out. Her other stories, by the way, also excellent. They all have something a little bit unique. I think it was a definite nod to Shakespeare and that kind of story, and I think it was done very well.
I respect it because, I mean, I'm not a mad Shakespeare fan, but it's just kind of cool that you can see his influence going back so far to other famous authors. It's, I don't know, it's a weird constant in literature.
It's a nice connecting thread.
Yeah.
I like the idea that all stories are built on other stories.
I also think that the moral dilemma at the heart of the story is a good choice. I can see why she would not want to be with this guy after he was apparently responsible for killing her family.
Some contemporary authors should take note. Just because it perfectly epitomizes, doesn't it, like a genuine ideological conflict, but it's not based on the character actually being a terrible person. Like, yes, there is an argument that him killing her family was terrible, but it's also very clearly within the context of a war where they were on different sides. So I just thought that was really cleverly done as an ideological conflict without making either character unsympathetic.
You're right, it's put conflict in their relationship in a believable way and without having that feeling that you sometimes get where they should just sit down and talk about it.
Yeah, like a lot of modern enemies to lovers, they don't commit to the actual ideological conflict. There's no real reason why they can't be together, or you'd think they wouldn't end up together. So I appreciated that her version. It could go either way, and I would probably respect the protagonist's decision.
Yeah, as much as I've said, oh, she's so dramatic, I do kind of think that in her situation you would be feeling as confused and conflicted as she is, because betraying your family is no small thing to do, and especially forgiving their murderer is, or who you perceive as their murderer, even if you didn't do it personally, is quite a big thing to do emotionally. So yeah, I agree with what you've said. It's a good one, good conflict to have.
And I liked that it wasn't entirely resolved through the supernatural means either. Like, yes, she went there for advice, but also ultimately what was the turning point in their relationship was that he saved her life. Like, it was a proactive action on both of their parts rather than just a ghost coming, ooh, forgive this man.
I thought it was also the dream she had because she saw him like an alternative version where he was sort of imprisoned and punished for what he'd done, and she hated it. She didn't want that for him.
Yeah. There's nothing like seeing the one you love being horribly punished to realize that actually, oh no, I don't want you out of my life.
It was a good way to use that supernatural element without having it just overwhelm everything else that's going on.
Yeah. It was supernatural but relied on a very human feeling, which grounded it.
So, does this count as enemies to lovers?
I think it does. I mean, I don't think it shows the entirety of the relationship within the story because it's obviously a short story, and an enemies to lovers story, if you're actually going to write it out, will typically take longer just because you've got more work to do to kind of realistically get the characters to certain points. But like, definitely, there's the implication that they would have been enemies, which suggests that there is an enemies to lovers background. So it's enemies to lovers again, which I love.
Yeah. They were in love before, and then the war happened, and then at the end of the story they're back together again. So it kind of oscillates.
Could it oscillate back again?
I think it could. But I think that's the nature of a lot of relationships, and that they're not stagnant.
It counts as enemies to lovers because even though maybe it wasn't, he was her personal villain, they were still on opposite sides of conflict and terrible things happened to her. Don't know much about what happened to him, but I think, does he say he's also the last of his?
Yeah.
So I assume they've both been through sort of similar tragedy, and maybe that's the point of understanding for the two of them.
Does that mean Romeo and Juliet is enemies to lovers?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Like, it's star-crossed lovers, isn't it? Like, it wouldn't be star-crossed if they weren't initially supposed to be enemies. I mean, actually, you know what? I take that back. Because there was never any indication of them being hostile with each other, so there's not that level of conflict. The whole tragedy of Romeo and Juliet is the ridiculousness of the enemies, enmity between the two families. That's why it's a tragedy. Enemies to lovers can still be a tragedy, but it's a different kind of thing. Like, enemies to lovers, to a certain extent, personally, I think requires the enmity to be justified, while Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet kind of mocks it, or at least points out how tragic it is and how unreasonable.
Agreed.
Why do you think enemies to lovers is so popular?
Because it's a good way to set up genuine tension in a relationship. So you've provided the source of the conflict right from the start, rather than having two people to get together and then just throw something in the middle for no reason.
Yeah, like, it's not a forced conflict when done right, it's a genuine thing. And I think it's also the idea that once you've been enemies with someone, it's the idea of, A, redemption for one of the characters is always possible. So the idea that no matter how bad things can get, you still have a path back to being loved and being deserving of love and happiness, which I think is a really important lesson for us to give in fiction. And two, there's the idea that your enemy will know you better than someone who you are always nice to will ever know. Because if you meet someone and you're always kind to them, to a certain extent, you're going to go into a relationship never knowing what they're like at their worst. If you come at it from the opposite side, where you know exactly what they are at their worst, and learn to love them despite that, and learn their good and positive qualities, then I think it's a lot stronger as a relationship, because you know it's not going to crumble at the first hurdle, because they've already had the hurdle. Also, it encourages good communication at its best.
So there's a thin line between love and hate.
They do.
There's got to be some truth in it.
Yeah, it's also great for tension and slow burn and internal conflict and all that jazz.
Just everything, really. He's good at everything.
It's my favourite romantic trope, like, by far.
Really? I didn't know that about you.
You'd never guess that. I'm just totally into the fluffy, wholesome coffee shop romance, like,
No, you're not.
let them be childhood sweethearts. Actually, you know what? Childhood sweethearts to rivals to enemies, back to lovers. Boom.
Is that your ideal love story?
It is a good one. You've got so much history and tension there.
Might get whiplash.
If you spread it out, it's alright.
Yeah, it wouldn't be one to do in a short story, certainly, but it's the idea of having so much history and complexity in a relationship, which I think more closely mirrors what we may face in real life. Also, you get all the mutual pining And oh no, they don't love me, but they do love you.
Do you like me some mutual pining?
Also, you get character growth because they're forced to see each other from each other's perspectives and gain more empathy, which is why I don't like the current trend of enemies to lovers, where it's if you just sat down and talked, it would be fine. No, you're not enemies. You're just idiots with bad communication skills and unhealthy relationships.
So does it have to be something properly like life or death for it to be a proper enemies to lovers?
I don't think it has to be life or death, but I think it does need to be a genuine ideological conflict that you can't just solve easily. It has to matter.
Yes, it has to have the stakes have to be high enough for it to impact the character in a really meaningful way.
Otherwise, it's like rivals to lovers, which is fun, but a lot more playful, I guess, where it might not be such personal stakes. Or there's not the same level of animosity necessarily.
All right, let's move on. What are we on? Gothic?
I mean, to a certain extent, we've talked about it being Gothic. So, I mean, Wikipedia at least says that it's one of several Gothic tales that Mary Shelley published in The Keepsake, which The Dream is part of, but The Dream is a lot more ambiguously Gothic than some of Shelley's other tales. But arguably, it engages with common Gothic themes such as water love, messages, dreams, and visions of ghosts. My query would be are we actually counting it as Gothic or not? Because it is ambiguously Gothic, which means it's borderline.
Why is it ambiguous?
Deals with Gothic tropes, but it isn't necessarily fully Gothic in the same way as some things like it's got a heavy romantic element, and while you do get Gothic romance as a genre,
It's not doomed.
yeah, the Gothic romances were around at the time, so it's kind of got that, but
It's definitely Gothic. You can't tell me this isn't Gothic. When she has a dream about this guy like in chains dying, and then she's like, oh, I should probably love him then, even though he killed my family. That's like very Gothic in my book.
I mean, I agree that it's Gothic. I was just curious why anyone would say it wasn't, or that it was ambiguously Gothic, hence
Because they're crazy.
it's Wikipedia. Everyone knows Wikipedia is always right.
It's not. They're wrong.
I guess the only thing I can think of is that it doesn't completely play out the tropes the way they'd usually be played.
No, it's not got a dread-filled atmosphere, for example. Like, it gets a bit spooky at the end, but for the most part, it's not really in a gloomy, decaying setting or anything.
Would you say it was more tame than a typical Gothic story?
More positive, not necessarily more tame.
It does have a happy ending for the romance, and I mean, I haven't read a lot of Gothic, but I thought a lot of the romances in that genre were doomed.
Quite often, you get a lot of the enemies to lovers, except they never get to the lovers stage where they go lovers to enemies instead. Yeah, but yeah, it's definitely got a lot of Gothic tropes that it engages with. Like the very fact she's there in a white nightgown is a very Gothic image.
So maybe it is Gothic, but it's like softer Gothic.
It is Gothic. Stop debating. It's stupid. It's obviously Gothic.
I just want to know why that dude on. Fine, we'll ignore the dude on Wikipedia.
Oh my god.
I regret bringing this up.
I'm sorry.
Like, I agree that it's Gothic, but now I really want to argue the opposite just to see how much I can wind you up.
Yeah, it's such a contrarian.
It was a serious attempt to understand, and that's the only thing I can think of, that it uses Gothic tropes, so it is Gothic, but it doesn't use them in the same way as other stuff used it. So that's why it's queried on Wikipedia.
I mean, it did say ambiguously, so it never said it was entirely un-Gothic. But, this is why you need sources, because there is no source for that.
I feel like if you use some things that are from a genre, then you become that genre, even if you don't do them in the standard way.
I think you can be a blend of genres, but for example, using romance in a story doesn't inherently make it a romance genre novel.
No, but it does mean that saying it's a romance isn't wrong.
Yeah, but in terms of the useful categorization we would use, for example, when recommending books or categorizing in a bookshop, you wouldn't necessarily put this in the romance section.
Well, true. But that's like when you have to pick one kind of situation. But yeah, I see your point.
I'm just going to have to continue finding weird stances just to throw you off again.
You don't even have to try, it just happens.
I know, it's delightful.
Look, the prose, let's talk about the prose because it's beautiful. It uses lots of long words, but I didn't really mind. I found it not too hard to read. Some of the sections are just really pretty, honestly. The part where she's talking about how everything in the world loves things, it sounds really dumb in concept, but on the page it's beautiful. I love it.
I mean, it is a beautiful idea, isn't it? Like, I think we do often forget that everyone in the world loves something else. Like, it's not a popular notion necessarily at the moment.
It's very poetic.
But without getting in the way of the story.
Like, it's like Gothic cathedrals. It still does its job as a cathedral, but it's got all the wonderful adornments. Kind of how I feel about her style.
I did have to concentrate on it a bit more than I normally would, but I think it was worth it.
But then I think that's the case with any 19th century novels that I've read for the most part. I think partially because we just don't naturally engage with the same context that would be natural to people reading it at the time.
As before, I was sort of laughing at the dramatic dialogue, but it actually works really well, and I think this story would definitely be poorer without it.
It's the idea of everything being heightened, isn't it? Like, you can't just have your dramatic scene take place on a sunny day. It has to be during a dark and stormy night. Everything is amped.
I did laugh when it invoked a dark and stormy night.
I personally think that's actually a really good description. I know it gets slated a lot, but it does the job very quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, it's just kind of perfect for the atmosphere of this story. I think it's become a bit of a meme, but it's a natural place to start. Yeah, I like the prose style. It's nice to read.
There are many themes in this story which are very common to Mary Shelley's work and her life. Death features prominently. Please find a story Mary Shelley has written where someone does not die. I don't think you can do it. If you can, I'll be impressed. Dreams. When I read about how she came up with the idea of Frankenstein, she called it a waking dream. She apparently just stayed up all night thinking about Frankenstein.
It's a very good story.
Also, the kind of complicated romance was very reminiscent of her life. So I suppose the suggestion is that a lot of her writing is semi-autobiographic, or at least she takes a lot of inspiration from her own life. Do you think that's correct and common? And, I don't know, thoughts?
I think that's quite common, but I also think if you've got a particular aesthetic and vibe, you kind of are more likely to end up in situations that go with your vibe. I mean, not necessarily. I live a very normal life despite everything I write about, but
So you think she was born Gothic?
yeah, some people just have that kind of soul.
I think it's natural to take from real life, but not necessarily the exact scenarios, but the emotions of it and the way stuff makes you feel. I think you can't help but put it in your writing. And the best authors, I think, take common emotions and put them in their work with a way that resonates with the reader.
Yeah, it's how we identify and empathize with characters because they've gone through struggles like we have, or they feel the same way we have. Like, we may not never have battled a dragon, but when you're battling a dragon and you're exhausted and hungry, okay, I can relate. Like, we've all had to deal with things that seem too big on an empty stomach.
I've never had a romance with someone that killed my family, but I mean, I've definitely had kind of.
You felt conflicted.
Yes, exactly.
Especially when your father doesn't like them, as happened with Mary Shelley. So, I should probably start at the beginning. Mary Shelley was Gothic from the start. Her mother died when she was very young, and she would spend a lot of time at her mother's grave, which I think is creepy, but apparently she liked it, so okay.
I mean, I spent a lot of time in graveyards as a kid.
Well, that explains a lot.
Yeah, we had one next door, but anyway.
To the extent that she apparently first admitted that she was in love with Percy Shelley by her mother's grave. Also quite creepy, in my opinion.
She wanted to get her mother's blessing.
I don't know. Well, they used to meet there because her father did not like this Percy Shelley guy. They had to meet kind of in secret because Percy said, "Hey, I'm going to pay off all your debts," and then he didn't, hence not liking. That's basically how it went down. It's a complicated story, but that's the gist of it. And also he was married, so that's already a problem. But Mary was apparently fine with that, and then they got together anyway. And then she had so many children, and pretty much all of them died.
Oh, that's sad.
It is very sad. It just gets worse. Like her first child died like 2 months, and then she had some that got older and then died anyway, and then she miscarried. It's just horrible, and it's just a very complicated life that she led. And I do like the story though of how she started on Frankenstein, because they were a group of them like on holiday. It was like Mary, Percy, Lord Byron, some other people, and then there was a challenge to write ghost stories. I think Lord Byron started it. He said, "Oh, we should write ghost stories."
Yeah, they did a Doctor Who episode based on this.
Did they? I don't really remember.
Newest series of 13. It's great.
Yeah, Lord Byron was very popular at the time. Apparently the people at the hotel were like renting out telescopes so people could try and spy on them.
He was one of the first celebrities, I think I read somewhere.
Yeah, basically.
Mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
Anyway, Mary wrote her ghost story. The others, I don't think, really got very far. And it was published as Frankenstein, anonymously, because she was a woman, and women don't publish things, don't be silly. Everyone thought it was Percy Shelley's book.
Was that strange? Did he write other things like Frankenstein?
Well, good question.
It says here he was a poet, so I wondered if nobody sort of questioned that assertion that he wrote Frankenstein. I wondered if whether anybody suspected that maybe he didn't write it because it's not really the kind of thing that he writes. But if you're that close to someone, maybe you do write the same. I don't know.
I haven't read any of his work, but just looking at the titles, it seems like it's probably kind of gothic. And if you're married to Mary Shelley, well, it's got to be the case.
They've got a bit of a vibe together, yeah.
He helped edit it, apparently, and then was credited as being the author, which is just not really true. And it was disputed for a long time how much he actually put into it. Anyway, he died, and then they cremated him, and she kept part of his heart in a drawer for the rest of her life.
I was hoping you'd tell that story, yeah.
Also, locks of her children's hair she kept. It's been disputed whether it's actually true, but I don't see why it wouldn't be. Why would you make that up?
For the drama.
Maybe. I did also hear a story, I don't know if this is true, that they were cremating him and then one of his friends dived into the fire and seized his heart.
Wow.
That just doesn't sound true.
I mean, I could believe it.
That's got to be someone committed to the marketing behind the Gothicness, or whatever the 18th century, or whatever century it was, version of marketing is.
Lord Byron apparently he used to take people's skulls and make cups out of them.
Nice. I mean, recycling's good for the planet.
He wanted Percy Shelley's skull, but he didn't get it.
Mary had first dibs.
Is that like a sign of affection? Is that how you know Lord Byron liked you?
I think so, I guess.
You had a pretty enough brain for me to drink out of.
Oh my god.
When Mary died, she wanted to be buried next to her mother's grave, her parents' grave, but Percy went there and was like, "This place kind of sucks." So he buried her in Bournemouth instead, which seems kind of bad. But then he did go in and have her parents removed from the grave in St Pancras and then moved down to Bournemouth so that they could all be buried together.
That's cute.
I don't know, man. I feel like if she wanted to be buried there, they should have buried her there. But, he kind of did his job, I suppose. So there you have it. The very gothic life of Mary Shelley told very quickly.
Thank you, I enjoyed it.
Yes.
So are there any other stories by Mary Shelley, short stories you would particularly recommend?
They're all good, honestly. The Mortal Immortal is great. It's about a guy who tries to become immortal and all the terrible things that happen. There's the other one, it's called Transformation. That one's very dramatic as well. I loved it. There are several more. They're all very good. I would recommend. And of course, Frankenstein, if you haven't read it.
If you don't want to read the novel of Frankenstein, though, of course, I would recommend it. The NT Live adaptation is also very good.
All right. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. As always, you can find all of our stories and previous episodes on our website at theshortstoryworkshop.com. If you would like to contact us, you can do so via Twitter. I am at MattBWriter, Mel.
At Ficaholic.
And Simone.
He_M_typewriter, also known as the modern typewriter.
All right. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye.